My husband ran a tab at a downtown club while I lay in the intensive care unit. He called a few friends, ordered shots, posted a video of himself on the dance floor, and didn't come see me until the next morning. Not because the hospital was locked or because he was stuck somewhere, but because he chose the party over the woman whose ribs were fractured and whose right leg was in a splint. When he finally walked into my room, the first thing he did was ask the nurse if she'd filed the insurance form. He acted like the night before had been one of those inconvenient things that happen to other people. That was the betrayal, not the crash, not even the fact that he'd been driving my car, but the small, brutal calculus he made that his time mattered more than my life. We had been married 9 years. His name is Mark. He wore suits for work and wore charm like a coat. People liked him quickly and loudly. I used to say he could talk a room into reality. For most of our marriage, that skill explained things for us. Why we had a house with smart light fixtures, why we had a second car, why our daughter went to a small private preschool when public school was 2 blocks away. It also explained why I had stopped announcing my plans to go back to work when our son was born. I trusted him to manage the money because he said he wanted me home with the kids. I trusted him because he made it easy to trust him. There was a bank account with his name as the primary, a mortgage under both our names, and a business checking account in his company's name where he said he kept the operating funds. I had an old laptop, like a handful of savings in my own account from summers I worked as a receptionist years earlier, and a shoebox of documents tucked into the bottom drawer of the bedroom dresser. I could not practically just pick up and leave us. I had no car when my leg was broken, no reliable income, a mortgage payment that day on the calendar, and 2 children under 7 who needed me to be able to sit up, to walk to their bedrooms and fold clothes. My dependency wasn't moral or shameful. It was a matter of logistics, of payroll dates and school pickup times, and the steep, steady inertia that happens when one partner handles the money. Because Mark controlled most of the visible finances, his choices had weight. His choices had consequences for how we ate and where the kids slept and whether our lights stayed on. The accident was short and blunt. While I was backing out of the driveway after dropping my daughter at preschool, Mark was behind me in our other car taking a call on speaker. He weaved between lanes on the boulevard to pass a delivery truck and, according to the police report, clipped my rear bumper, sending me into the curb. The paramedics who took me said I'd hit my head on the window, that the airbags had never deployed because the impact was slow and sideways. I remember the cold of the asphalt on my face and then nothing. When I woke, I could hear machines and the smell of antiseptic. Someone had placed a pale blue blanket over my knees. My daughter's backpack was still in the back seat, straps twisted. The hospital gown felt like a costume someone had chosen for me without asking. Mark texted that night from the club. "Crazy night, you okay?" I texted back once, and his reply took hours. The nurse told me later that he had shown the police a version of the story where we'd both paid for coffee that morning, where I'd misjudged space. He told my mother that I'd been fine after they x-rayed me. He told his friends I was being dramatic, that I always overreacted. Those words cut more than the broken ribs. At the hospital, they asked whether I wanted a social worker, whether I had someone to stay with me. I used my weak hand to scroll to my contacts, and there was Mark's photo at the top. He was the person who should have been there. He was the person who lived with me and who had the van I could not drive and who knew where our health insurance card was. The fact that he did not come back until after I had been given morphine, cleaned, and told I might be kept overnight felt like a decision that would shape everything after it. At first, the lies were small and persistent, like ants. He said he had left my phone in the car and couldn't find it. He said the only reason he didn't post on social media about the accident was because he'd been worried and didn't want to make a fuss. He told other people that he had come by the hospital briefly and that I was overly upset. He hugged me in the hallway and called it an apology. I believed him because we had made a life of reconciling with his apologies. He bought me flowers in the hospital cafeteria and made a point of telling the nurse that we're fine. The flowers smelled faintly of disinfectant, and the nurse tucked my chart under her arm as if to say the real things were on paper, not between us. The first escalation came with the bills. A week after I was discharged, the mail began to pile up. Medical billing statements, notices from the imaging center, a demand letter for a portion of the co-pay that had not been paid. I reached for Mark's laptop to search for our insurance card, and it was logged in under his email. I opened the browser and found a flurry of charges from that night. A hotel, a bar tab, a rideshare flagged at 3 a.m. that dropped him 2 blocks from our house. When I asked him directly and quietly, "Were you at a club while I was in the ER?" He said he had stepped out for 5 minutes to take a call and had been home by 1. He said the rideshare must have been a mistake. He laughed, and the laugh was not the one that used to come easy when he told a joke. It had a shade of irritation. My response was to call the rideshare company. The customer service rep quoted me a pickup time and a GPS drop-off that matched the club, not our neighborhood. He shrugged at my confusion. I felt my control slipping. The reaction he had to my asking questions was surgical. He began to control access to things I had taken for granted. Extraneous fees popped up on our joint credit card that he said were for company expenses. He insisted we needed to keep the family savings intact for a slower season and that I should not touch the emergency fund. He told me he would manage the hospital bills, and then, when I tried to follow up with the billing office, they told me he had paid only a fraction and moved the rest into a payment plan that would come out of our account monthly. When I confronted him, he told me to stop panicking and let him handle it. He said if I made this a thing, he would have to get a lawyer to protect the kids' future. That was the first time I realized he was not just avoiding responsibility, he was weaponizing my dependence. The second wave came through people. Mark is the sort of man who has a network, clients, alumni, parents at the school pickup line. He started telling our mutual friends that I had been reckless, that I had been the one backing out, and that we both had a moment. The story spread in the softened language people like to use when they don't want to take sides. It became a quiet erosion. Our neighbor, who had watched us garden together for years, began to walk past my house and act as if she didn't know me. Or teachers who had hugged my daughter now sent me curt emails asking whether I would be available for a meeting because Mark would like to go over logistics. People who meant well began to ask whether I was ready to get back on my feet and use that phrasing like a plan that I had agreed to, not a reality I was trying to build. When the humiliation turned to exclusion, it was small and deliberate. Mark changed the password to the account where our daughter's school payments were set up. And when I asked him for the new password, he told me to check with the school office because they could resend it. He then scheduled a parent-teacher conference for a weekday afternoon and told the teacher he would take it because I needed rest. He did not tell me the time. He later told me he had assumed I would be too tired. He left a voicemail for my mother where he said, in a tone meant to be casual, that I wasn't recovering as fast as expected and suggested my mother come more days to help without clarifying the situation. People rallied in ways that made me feel both grateful and invisible. They helped, but they also deferred to the man who owned the narrative. Then came financial pressure that felt like a slow squeeze. One morning, I tried to log into the mortgage account to confirm the auto pay date and found no access. The bank told me that while the mortgage was jointly held, Mark had linked the account to his business line and arranged for an account sweep. He could, the banker said, move funds as the primary person on the line. I remember the way the banker's eyes slid away when I asked for options. We have protections, she said, but they're legal processes. That meant time and money and the thing I lacked most after the crash, mobility. Mark began to hint that if I insisted on being difficult about money, we would have to downsize. He put a post-it on the refrigerator listing expenses with precise decimals, as if that would be a contract between two people who had once slept in the same bed. Humiliation, again, appears in the small places. He would answer my questions with a smile that suggested I had misunderstood the world. You don't understand how this works, he'd say, as he added something to a spreadsheet on his laptop. He began to interrogate how I spent money in the past, as if every latte and extra pair of shoes were evidence of profligacy. He later told our accountant that my being out of work had been a mutual decision, so I wouldn't feel pressured to return to a career that would stretch me thin. People nodded at that phrasing. In private, he called my attempts to ask questions temper tantrums or post-accident confusion. I felt my concerns reframed as irrational, my pain given an adjective that made me small. The exclusions became more official as he began to do things that required access only he had: the spare keys, the passwords, the bank card with higher limits. He started interviewing babysitters without telling me, telling friends with a smile, "We're making a plan so she can be safe while she recovers." When I asked him about the sitters, he acted offended. "You don't want strangers in this house?" He put them on the schedule and then changed it. When the kids would ask for me, these sitters would answer, "Mama needs her rest." The kids asked fewer questions, the adults did the asking for them. I felt boxed into a role that was shrinking, patient, sleepy, grateful for the help, while decisions that affected all of us were made in conversations I wasn't invited to. Sometimes his betrayals were legal in their face, and sometimes they were not. He signed a document at the bank that allowed him to take on a line of credit for business expenses, and within weeks there were charges on our household credit card that had nothing to do with the company. He paid a retainer for a lawyer who needed to look at our options, and that lawyer called within days and asked me to sign paperwork acknowledging that I had limited capacity after the accident. I declined because I was coherent and because it felt like a staged play where I didn't know my lines. The lawyer retreated with a polite sigh and said, "We'll revisit once she's more stable." The phrase, "we'll revisit," had the tone of a man rearranging furniture while I sat on a small chair. The worst escalation started when he began using our children as an argument. He would say, in those moments when he wanted me to relent, "For the kids' sake, we need stability." Then he would schedule things, trips, extracurricular sign-ups, orthodontist consults, that made it impossible for me to simply grab my jacket and walk out. He would text me photos of bills with the caption, "This is for the kids," as if the presence of the word kids justified any behavior. He used their routines like levers. The more I tried to negotiate, the more he tightened the screws. A new fee for late payment, a locked online account, a set of new passwords. Those were small betrayals with serious friction, the kind that turn any motion toward leaving into a logistic nightmare. I reached a quiet low point 2 months after the accident. The doctor had cleared me to begin physical therapy, but refused to sign me out from under observation because the hospital wanted a plan for support at home. Social services called and asked about a plan. Mark volunteered that he had arranged for care and for financial oversight. When they asked whether anyone else would be staying with me, he said no, that everything was under control. I felt the room contract around me. I had never felt so alone in a house that used to feel full. My mother lived 3 hours away and could not take leave from work. My best friend worked nights at the hospital and could not manage a morning routine with 2 small kids. There was a pile of mail on the kitchen table and an outstanding invoice for physical therapy that I could not pay without the account information he had. I understood, and in a new and absolute way, what powerlessness felt like. The ability to make choices stripped by someone else slowly, surgically, and without fanfare. It was during that low point that the single mistake happened. The mistake was small and human. Mark took a video at the club and uploaded it with a caption that named him and tagged friends. One of those friends, someone who had once babysat our kids and had seen Mark at his most careless, watched the video the next morning, and it hit him differently. He remembered me in the hospital and felt suddenly and sharply that the man on the screen did not match the man he had trusted to be the responsible adult. He sent the video privately to my sister with a note. This was the night she was in ICU. My sister, who had been quietly watching from far away, and sent it to our cousin and to a lawyer who had helped another family friend. Within hours, the video had been time-stamped against the hospital admission records. The bar's footage, which the lawyer requested, showed Mark entering at 11:58 p.m. and leaving at 2:17 a.m. The hospital's log recorded me arriving at 11:20 p.m. It was not a grand confession. It was evidence, and evidence has a way of rearranging the room. Once the time-stamped footage existed, things moved differently. The lawyer called Mark and asked him to come in. The bank received a request from an attorney representing a third party to put a temporary hold on transfers, a common fraud prevention measure when there is a dispute. The school nurse, a woman who had been kind to me for years, called my mother and said quietly, "Whatever you need, come now." That phrase, "whatever you need," had a heft I had not heard before. With the bar footage, a social worker visited my house and, for the first time since the accident, asked the kinds of questions that carried weight. She took stock of who had access to what. She listened. When she left, she said a phrase I had not allowed myself to hope for. We can put an emergency plan in place. We used that momentum. I will not say we conjured it out of nothing. We did not. My sister borrowed a van. My friend texted people who owed favors. My cousin, a contractor, found 2 movers who owed him a favor. The social worker made a safety assessment and noted that the children could be with family temporarily while we resolved the financial issues and dealt with the bills. The hospital, now aware of how the events had unfolded, provided documentation and spoke with the police about neglect. The lawyer filed for an emergency injunction to prevent further sweeping of funds. The bank acknowledged the restrictions and, in doing so, froze some of the more dubious transfers Mark had authorized. Mark's reaction to the shift was sharp and immediate. He called the lawyer and disparaged me to anyone who would listen. He texted friends and clients about my instability and asked them to testify that I was not the same. He threatened quietly and with a smugness that made my spine ache to pursue custody if I made the family a scene. But the lines had shifted, the evidence had been organized, the bank statements, the bar footage, the hospital logs. Those things were not feelings. They were facts. In court, facts are heavier than charm. The result of the turning point was not dramatic in a single spectacle. There were no explosions, no cinematic confrontations. Instead, there was paperwork and phone calls and procedural motions that felt both endlessly small and enormously consequential. The emergency injunction froze certain transfers and prevented Mark from draining joint accounts while the dispute continued. The social worker's assessment allowed my mother to take the kids for a temporary period while I completed a medically supervised plan for recovery. The movers, quietly and without ceremony, packed up what we agreed to remove. Children's clothes, a few dishes, family pictures, my laptop, and the shoebox of documents. I sat in the living room in a chair I could finally move into without too much pain and watched as people I trusted carried boxes out the front door and loaded them into my sister's van. When Mark returned home that day, because he had been at a client dinner and because the business meeting had wrapped late, the house was empty in the way a stage is empty after a production. The couch was there, the TV mounted to the wall, but the little intimacies that make a house a life were gone. The backpacks were missing from the hooks. The children's drawings had been taken from the refrigerator. The toothbrushes were not in the cup by the sink. He walked through the rooms with his phone out, filming for the friends he still needed to persuade. He called my mother and then my sister. He called the lawyer. He demanded to know what had happened. He said again that he had assumed care would be coordinated, that he had been out of town for work. I could hear the anger in his voice, not because he had lost things, but because the narrative had slipped from his control. He found the note by the front door, a folded piece of printer paper with a list of contact numbers, the lawyer, the social worker, my sister's number. It said, simply and without flourish, that the children were safe with family and that we would be in touch when we had a plan. It did not explain the bank freeze or the injunction. The note was not meant to punish. It was meant to be practical. He stood there for a long time with his hand on the door frame. He looked briefly and without pretense exhausted. Then he walked out again and got into his car as if to find a place where his version of events still mattered. The consequences that followed were steady and, I think, necessary. We did not ride off into a clear resolution. You don't spend 9 years entangled with someone and have everything undone by a single legal motion. There were months of discovery, of lawyers asking for spreadsheets and emails, of mediation sessions where his team attempted to paper over the evidence with generous sounding offers that would have stripped me of the autonomy I had finally felt returning. He argued that he had been the primary breadwinner, that the house was his business asset, that our children needed the stability he could provide. What moved me was not the rhetoric, but the pragmatics. He could not easily show the court that he was the only responsible adult when there were receipts with bar tabs in the middle of the night and hospital logs that said I had been admitted at 11:20 p.m. In the months after the house was emptied, we reached a settlement that was not cinematic, but that allowed me to breathe. The bank, slowly convinced by the documentation, agreed to release certain funds for medical bills, while an independent auditor reviewed suspicious transfers. My name was reinstated to access certain accounts with new safeguards. The children remained with family while we worked through a parenting plan that allowed for supervised visits until I had healed enough to manage pickups and drop-offs. That Mark was ordered to take a parenting course and to settle certain liabilities. He did not go to jail. There was no dramatic arrest. The law intervened in small, bureaucratic ways, and those small things accumulated into a new reality. He moved out of the house sometime in late summer. He rented a small apartment in a neighborhood I had not known he was interested in. He kept the car for a while, but later traded it in. The house we had chosen together, the one with the kitchen island where his fingerprints were in the sealant from the day we first installed it, remained in both our names until the mortgage was refinanced and the property was listed. The listing did not happen in one afternoon. It was a measured letting go, staging, paperwork, a broker who told me that buyers like the light in the living room. He asked for a portion of the proceeds. I accepted. It felt less like victory and more like an adult exchange that settled things into a new framework. What surprised me in the quiet after was how ordinary most of it looked. There were no banners on the street announcing that I had won. There were no morning shows calling. My children slept in different beds for a while and then returned slowly to routines. Mark sent a check once with a handwritten apology and a small envelope for the kids' school supplies. He asked in a way that was timid and private if he could have Thanksgiving this year. I said nothing for a long time and then suggested he write to the mediator. He did. My sense of the betrayal did not dissolve because he moved into a smaller apartment or because the house was sold. The betrayal is a scar. Not only because he chose a night on a dance floor over a hospital bed, but because the choices after that night showed a pattern. He had used access and perception as levers for power. He had weaponized people's desire for a tidy narrative. He'd assumed he could charm his way out of consequence. The thing that changed the arc was not a speech I gave or a dramatic confrontation. It was the slow assembling of facts and the decision of people around us to treat my account as credible. There is a mechanical, procedural justice in that, distinct from the messy humankind that we all hope for. I found through it all that the things I believed about independence were different than the ones I had thought. Independence is not only money or a job or a car. It is also the ability to ask questions and to have those questions taken seriously. It is knowing that when you name a fact, people will not immediately set up a counterstory to explain it away. It is learning to hold a list of documents close, to know where a birth certificate is, to save an extra copy of an insurance card in your purse. These are small, unromantic acts. They are what resistance looks like in a life where power is often disguised as care. If I could give any tidy ending, it would be dishonest. He did not become a cartoon villain, nor did I become a headline hero. We both became, in different ways, people who had to pick the pieces up off a countertop. We negotiated and argued, and in the end, agreed to a parenting plan. He teaches our son to ride a bike. I go to physical therapy twice a week. I sometimes sit in the kitchen and make coffee in a cup he used to use because the smell still feels familiar and because rituals do not disappear with one action. There is a new rhythm now. It is not always easy. It is steady. If you're still with me, thank you for listening to this long, slow confession. If this struck a chord with you and if you want to support this channel, please leave a like. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, subscribe. And if you have a story you feel safe sharing, maybe about a small betrayal that grew, or about a moment when the facts finally mattered, leave it in the comments. I read them